Hey everyone, welcome to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Bacasa, and the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast aims to bring the best stories and tips. Stories and tips from those that truly make an impact within the sport of fly fishing. I'll dig into the past, present, and future of our guests, uncovering their amazing story and journey. Join me each week as I interview a new guest from somewhere around the globe. If you're not yet a subscriber, help by subscribing now so I can attract the most influential guests and sponsors to the podcast. Let's make this the top fly fishing specific podcast available. Today's show is brought to you by the following sponsors. Angler's Coffee, a brand of coffee for anglers by anglers. Owner Joan Monahan grew up fly fishing, and after spending 40 years in the coffee industry, perfecting blend and brew process, he retired to creating a coffee blend and brand for the sport of his passion. Go to www.anglerscoffee.com and pick up a bag of your choice. My personal favorite is the pre-ground caddis blend. It has a perfect balance of body, aroma, and acidity to kickstart my day. Thank you, Anglers Coffee, for supporting the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. We look forward to supporting you and your business. Again, www.anglerscoffee.com. Dupa Fish, that's D-U-P-E-A fish.com, www.dupafish.com. Coming soon, but head over now, pre-register, and make sure you are ready to receive all the notices of the great deals that we'll be having coming your way. With years of accumulated DIY, Todd and I have traveled and booked experience all over the globe. We know how hard it is to customize a trip to you and your group's particular needs. We will have a comprehensive list of service providers and guides to help you in selecting the perfect trip for your and your party's needs. Book a trip with us and have the adventure of a lifetime. That's Dupa Fish. www.dupafish.com. All right, everyone, welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. This is Christian Bacasa, your host, and this week we've got Andy Selvig, a friend of mine that I've met online, and we've got some really cool stuff to talk about this week. I think some exciting news. Andy, great to have you on the show, my man.
Oh, hi.
Yeah, so, it was really good connecting with you the other day, learning a little bit about you, and glad you're able to join us and share with our audience. Let's just kind of kick off with diving in how you got into fly fishing.
I was thinking about it this morning, and it's all the men in our family as kids were kind of almost like field biologists, just going out collecting bugs, frogs, turtles, whatever. And it started out with bugs, actually, just going out at night in South Dakota, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, with like a flashlight and hunting for like sphinx moths and conehead katydids and different bugs that are kind of exotic that nobody knows is in their backyard. And
yeah, I've never even heard of those two. So those are new to me.
I'd be disturbing the neighbors after dark with a flashlight and like, who's back in the backyard? No, it's like, that's me, just a neighbor kid, and I'd be fine with that. And there's also like in South Dakota, there's these Cecropia moths and Polyphemus moths.
Okay.
That are really huge, ornate moths. And I learned how to find the cocoons. They really like silver maple trees, and silver maple trees kind of have this habit of like having little offshoots branch off from the trunks of the trees. Okay. And then the caterpillars like to crawl down, and then they'll weave their little silken cocoons in there. So I'd collect about 30 of these in a season, and then in the springtime they'd all kind of hatch out.
Oh, nice. So what would you do with them? Cool. Just like put them in a box, or
sometimes I'd let them go, I guess. I would. Yeah, I had like a framed collection with the pins in them and whatnot. Cool. But and then that kind of gets, the fly fishing kind of starts with your kind of first encounters with water and just wondering what's under there and investigating it. It started out with a with my bike and a 5-gallon pail and a great big minnow net that my dad had that I just totally shredded and worn out. And you're collecting crayfish and catching little snapping turtles and painted turtles and garter snakes. Just just going out and collecting things and seeing what's around. And then I would find little outlets that were going back into the main river channel of the river that went through Sioux Falls, and you would net up all kinds of little minnows and dace that were just there. There's some really pretty native species of I can't remember what they're called, but they're rainbow colored things and different shiners that were just absolutely stunning and gorgeous. And then as a bonus, maybe once in a while you'd get like a giant water bug or a giant water beetle, and those things were just fascinating and cool. And then, I think for me, fly fishing, I guess, has always been a little bit about collecting things and just cataloging things in your mind and, encountering something for just a brief moment and just kind of releasing it, letting it go.
Yeah.
When I kind of got into fishing by way of spin fishing, fly fishing, in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, it wasn't, there's not, most of fly fishing kind of starts with trout, and opportunities for trout are just not very local there. So I grew up with spin fishing, but as a kid, I didn't have patience for maybe like walleyes or largemouth bass. That kind of felt like more of, more of a commitment for your evening or your day when you're fishing. I wanted more of the instant reward. I wanted the bluegills or the perch. So
you wanted catching, not fishing.
I wanted
like most kids, right? I mean, come on.
I wanted something. Yeah, you want something to hold in your hand and have a look at it, and just set it back. And so with the spin fishing, I gravitated towards smaller, artificial lures and things that will catch small fish, but also maybe just large enough. If there's a 2-pound largemouth cruising by, you'll get them.
Yeah. Okay.
And as a special reward, of course, there's nothing better than like fishing a bunch of little sunnies or perch, and then along comes a pumpkin seed, and you get maybe 1 out of 30 sunfish that you catch is one of these pumpkin seeds. There's nothing better than having that in your hand. So when I did kind of get introduced into fly fishing, I think it was just like, okay, here's a medium that casts something that is a very tiny or small presentation very, very well, and does it with some degree of delicacy. So I was like, oh yeah, I absolutely want to do that. And of course, by that time I'd, grown up a bit, and I was regularly fishing bass and walleyes. And since I was in South Dakota, those are the species that I kind of learned on. So throwing kind of bigger streamers, and this is a little bit before, maybe the Kelly Gallup or just some of the streamer craze had really hit.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was back then. I was just kind of tying pretty crude flies, but they looked fishy in the water, and they were poorly tied, but they caught fish.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the tying is for us, right? I mean, the fish don't really pay all that much. And if it looks halfway decent, they're going to attack it, especially those predator fish. But
right. I mean, there are so many people that are excellent, fisher people, and they tie enormously crude flies, but the triggers are there. The things that are necessary to catch the interest of the fish are absolutely there. And you can dress it up a little bit or not, but what's important is just the basic things that will elicit a strike.
Yep, exactly. And by the way, you have some incredible flies I've seen. They're
thank you so much.
Man. Really, you have a talent for that.
Well, I think over the past 8 or 10 years, I've worked hard at getting something that has a definite look to it and will stand up, hopefully, against anything. But before then, I think my flies were just very, very functional. They were just as much effort as it took to catch a fish. And now I kind of, try to thread that line between not doing too much effort, but having some pride in your ties. And it's a tough line to thread. I think some things are very obviously overboard, and I try to stay away from that. But also, some of those things I don't quite have the patience to achieve. But
yeah. But when you get them right, man, they look really sexy and they work. That's what's, effectiveness is important.
Yeah, and I think I try to go for something that's more about how it looks, or I'm sorry, less about how it looks in the vise. But I think everything that I do has some function in the water, has some advantage to it. That's not just about how the fly looks, but and I think there's a lot of things that when you do get them right, it does result in something that looks kind of sexy. So yeah, just going with that.
Yeah. Very cool. So how old were you when you started fly fishing?
Oh, let's see. I must have been mid-20s.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
And
so
I kind of been
getting around, you have your own independence, and it sounded like you had a pretty good background in, really the entomology, biology side of things, and facilitated your curve, I would think, quite a bit.
Yeah, I think fly fishing pairs really well into understanding what's going on beneath the surface and what's happening. Fly fishing people, especially with the entomology side, are pretty familiar with what's going on inside a body of water from top to bottom. And I think that's just kind of a natural progression of where I started out as a kid.
Mm-hmm. And then you had some mentors that kind of brought you into the fly fishing world, or did you start to follow and educate yourself with some certain people in mind? You mentioned Kelly Gallup, obviously. I know you have a background in
Kelly Gallup is kind of that kind of thing is something I picked up kind of later along. I got a brother that's about 10 years older than me. He lives down in Colorado, and that's where I first kind of got the itch to pick up a fly rod and try it out. And I think for me, it was really bizarre and backwards to hold a fly rod for the first time and try to cast the line, coming from a spin. Just the challenge of learning how to cast the thing and operate it properly, I think was the first thing that grasped me. And then later on, I learned how to actually fish with it. But yeah, my brother was out in Colorado, and he was all about trout fishing in North Platte River and some of the impoundments up in the North Park area of Colorado. So we'd go out and visit once a year, and then back in South Dakota, and I'd take the fly rods out walleye fishing or bass fishing, but usually the fly rod was along for the ride, and it was actually spin fishing. And then if I found an opportunity where fish were in shallow water or just otherwise susceptible to the fly rod, I would absolutely try to catch them on a fly rod any chance I had.
Yeah. What was it about the fly rod that you started to lean towards, or that really attracted you?
The fact that I guess that there's just the cast, the fact that you're working with a piece of rope that you're sending an energy wave through to turn over a fly. Mm-hmm. The hand lining aspect of fishing with a fly rod, where you're not necessarily using a reel, but you're always manipulating the fly bringing in slack line by hand, or in the case of a streamer, you're manipulating the fly both with your hand on the rod and with your the other hand on the line. Mm-hmm. When you catch a fish and you play a fish, it's a two-hand operation. Same thing, one hand on the rod, one on. It's almost like I'd almost equate it to like if you're somebody who prefers driving stick on your car versus an automatic. You're more involved with the driving, and you're just you're locked in with the process. There's more of you in the process and a little bit less of a mechanized reel.
I've never heard that analogy, and you just gave me shivers because it's exactly it for me. That's really good. I like that.
Yeah, and I have a lot of times it's really hard to define why you like something or you're gravitating toward it, because you don't think about it. It just kind of grabs onto you, and you go and you do it. and you don't know why. So when you have to sit down and think about, why was the reason? I'm still, what, 20 or 30 years later, I'm still wondering why I'm staying with fly fishing, and I just don't have interest in. I have passing interest in how other people fish. If somebody's a center pinner or somebody throws spinners
Right.
on a gear rod, I'm definitely interested in what they're doing and how I can apply it to what I do. But I don't really know the reason why I'm really stuck on a fly line, but I am.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that, because I fish conventional here and there, and
Mm-hmm.
it's extremely effective. And
Yeah.
but I think I'm the same way as you. When I do fish conventional, I always look at, what could I take from this and bring it back to fly fishing? I don't know why I do that either. I think it's just the challenge or something about it.
And the advent of spay, switch rods,
Yep.
full size spay rods, or even lines that will allow you to cast streamers on a single hand rod, those kinds of line systems. I think that's ultimately what pulled me out of spin fishing, is that those kinds of systems had some of the reach and some of the capabilities that fishing with spinning gear often has. And when you're fishing with a fly rod, and I'm in Minnesota, so a lot of times if you go to a place that's kind of congregated and you're fishing with a fly rod, and you're standing next to all these people that have spin gear, and they can easily plunk out 100-foot cast without trying, and here you are struggling to make 30 or 40 feet. It's kind of nice to have a system that you can have some of the same reach, and also kind of reach some of the same depths easily with some of the sink tips that you can throw on a two-handed rod. And that was kind of the final thing where I kind of started giving up the spin fishing totally, because the spin fishing for warm water species generally is a lot more effective than a fly rod, but I feel like I'm effective enough with a two-handed rod that I just don't. The spinning gear is just hanging out in the garage, being sad and neglected.
Yeah, that reach was the largest obstacle that it sounds like you were trying to overcome, and then once you achieved that, it became that much more attractive. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, also the reach, but also getting down, because as you're as you're casting further out into the river or the lake or wherever you're at, there's also a need to get a fly down, because you're out in deeper water.
Yeah.
And having something that makes working with a sinking line relatively easy compared to maybe a single hand rod is a huge up.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I remember a fun outing I had with a good buddy. We were up in these high mountain lakes, in this beautiful high mountain lake, tons of tiger trout, and we were catching nice tigers and having a good time. And then it just kind of shut down on us, and here we are beating our heads off the water for the next 2 hours and barely seeing any action. And I'll never forget it. We're fishing, and these 4 guys walk up with spin rods, and we were all alone, and we're like, oh man, here come these guys. And it was literally 1, 2, 3, 4 guys made casts all on their first cast. And then it was boom, 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 boom. I mean, they just all hooked up, and we were like, are you kidding me? We've been casting into this water for at least an hour and a half, and we haven't caught shit. And then these guys come up and just slam them all on one cast. And a lot of it was, they were able to get way out there and get deep real fast. And we didn't have that with our, overhead single hand lines. It's pretty funny to watch.
Right. And I think the other thing that I do with fly rods is, as I learn more pieces of water, more places to fish, you tend to gravitate towards those areas that work for fly fishing, and you have to accept that there's just going to be some spots that the no matter what kind of sink tip or two-handed rod you might have, it's just not going to work the same as a spinning rod. But as you learn the area that you fish and where fly fishing really works and where it kind of maybe doesn't, there's just enough places now that I can go to where I just don't have I think what you ended up in is a situation where, the limitations of your fly fishing just didn't apply to the situation, and the guys with the gear show up, and then you feel embarrassed. And I've had tons of experiences like that.
Yeah.
And I've either learned not to care or just find somewhere else to go. And sometimes I really care,
Yeah,
but
right.
more and more, it's just I'm going to the other places where
right?
I know the fly rod will work just fine.
Yeah, it is funny. I don't see as much of that here, I think, out in the West, but I could see being in the Midwest where there's just tons and tons of conventional anglers, would be a little more prevalent to have that experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's switch it up a little bit. I know you're into biology. You have quite a bit of conservation presence as well. I know some of the conservation groups you participate in.
I would say I have some minimal, but I think I'm kind of embarrassed to say that. I think we could all be embarrassed to say that we should be more involved. But compared with friends of mine, I don't think I'm even on the map. But not to negate what you're saying. But go ahead.
Yeah, but you have a passion for it. I know you participate in TU in your local chapter. You're part of the Lake Superior Steelhead Association, et cetera, and important cause. Where do you think you kind of gained that perspective? Was it from your childhood, just being engaged in biology and the environment very early?
Let's see. I think the driving thing is, issues with climate change, issues with Pacific salmon and steelhead populations dwindling, largely because of human activity. And just the thought that these things can actually go away. And also just the amount of people that would fish, and also the amount of people that would want to harvest on a resource that is a little too finite for everybody to harvest. I think more so than being a supporter of conservation groups, I think there needs to be like an individual ethic. For example, I fish steelhead on the North Shore of Lake Superior quite a bit, and what the North Shore is it's rivers that come down very high gradient, and a lot of times within a quarter mile to about a mile inland of Lake Superior, there's a final barrier where the fish cannot get up. And so you have kind of a bottleneck situation where if you're a good steelhead angler, it's really easy to catch fish. Especially if you're not necessarily fly fishing, if you're chuck and ducking or, stuff like that. And you'll just run into people. It's like, oh, I caught 250 steelhead this season. It's like, well, I know that's absolutely possible, but that person kind of did it by being a glutton and just not having any limitations. And there's a lot of rivers up there where, if you know anything about cortisol levels in fish and how that affects their outcomes with spawning and offspring, it can't be good for a steelhead to be hooked and played 8 or 10 or a dozen times before it can get in and out of a river system.
Yeah.
I don't like the thought of that. And, I like the idea of a person who's, absolutely comfortable with catching 1 to 3 fish and then just stopping. And I don't care what fishing method you use. There's a lot of people that feel like, swinging a fly for steelhead is the most ethical thing to do because it's one of the least productive methods. You really have to commit to it to get it to work, and you might only expect to grab once a day or a couple times a day. But I think more important than what fishing method you choose is just that when to quit. When all you're doing is out harassing fish, making it less of a numbers game. I know a lot of people say that they're kind of turned off by the numbers game, but I think there's a good reason for that.
There's a couple things I think that happen like that, and it's always cool to hear people's individual perspectives on those various attributes per se. Um, what for you is like maybe something that you like to do, or would maybe like to see others take into consideration from a conservation standpoint? It's always great to hear like when people have a passion about it. What do I try to do? How do I look at it, the problem as a potential resolution?
I would almost say it's for me personally, it's been really good to get to know some of the people that are retired from like the Wisconsin or Minnesota DNRs, and just learning what you can about the river and about the fish that you, all the peripheries that they just have intimate knowledge about, and people that you can just pick their brains. I think if if people had more interest in the river environment from top to bottom and wanted to know more about that and got connected with the people that actually do know about that, I think we'd make a tremendous amount of headway as far as individual. But does that make sense? I think there's so much that would follow just from that.
Yeah, it's just I think the way that I would think about that is you don't know what you don't know scenario, right?
Yeah,
and when you start to get educated, it's all of a sudden, oh, well, I didn't know about that. Maybe I should think about that differently. Is that?
I feel like I'm kind of halfway in that process. Like maybe 10 years ago, my mind wasn't there, and now my mind is kind of getting there. And my mind's kind of blowing open on what, how much I don't know, that there's these people that have spent their entire lives studying, and, in a 5-minute conversation, you just learned more than you did in the last 5 years,
right,
with these people.
Yeah. A lot of that is similar kind of scenario of the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I like a Christopher Hitchens quote. I was a big fan of Hitchens when he was around, but the sign of an educated person is how much we truly don't know.
Yeah, and then being able to accept that as a fact, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Big change. It's really cool. So why don't you, I'd love to hear some stories about maybe some of those mentors in your life and, some of the things that you learned from them. But before we do that, let's take a break, hear from our sponsors, and then we'll come back to that, okay?
Sounds good.
Angler's Coffee. We love fueling your next cast. We've been roasting coffee before coffee was cool. www.anglerscoffee.com. Dupa Fish. Coming soon. Pre-register now and get notified. www.dupafish, that's DUPEAfish.com. All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider. Christian Bacasa, your host, and we've got Andy Selvig on the line. Andy, before we broke, I asked you to tell us a few stories about, your mentors and maybe some of the things that you took from them. I'd love to hear that. Why don't you fire away?
Okay. Well, let's see. I would say about 10 years ago, I've always had Wednesdays off from work. And there's a fly shop that's relocated to St. Paul, but it was out in a suburb called Lake Elmo at the time. It's Bob Mitchell's Fly Shop. And on Wednesdays, I would just, in the wintertime, I would just go there to hang out and tie flies and drink coffee with the Lost Boys. It was just a crowd of kind of retirees that would just hang out at the fly shop all day. So for some reason on Wednesdays, and I was always there. And that's where I met Scott Thorpe. And he at the time was a retired architect he'd retired from architecture to become a full-time fly fishing guide. So he'd be doing summers up in Alaska guiding for king salmon, resident rainbow trout, and probably some dollies, and there'd be some chum and some silvers that would be in his river. He was in a helicopter lodge that was just kind of I think about 40 minutes by helicopter outside of Anchorage, and I can't remember the river that he was on. But and then in the fall and the spring, he would be a steelhead guide in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and that was the guy that really got me kind of into steelheading. I'd been steelheading maybe about 5 years before that, and I didn't really quite understand steelhead. I think I had become pretty decent at stream trout in the driftless area of Minnesota and Wisconsin. Little tiny limestone streams with trout that are super selective and fussy and spooky. And when I got into steelhead fishing, I was like, well, there's far less fish in the river, but I felt like they were going to be as selective as brown trout. So from the beginning, I think I made steelheading as complicated as steelhead can be, or challenging for some people. I added several layers of challenge on top of that didn't exist. So when I got to get out with Scott, I kind of got to learn that it's a little bit simpler than that, even though that there's fewer fish and it might be a little tougher to connect with a single fish. But once you do, then everything else you were worrying about just instantly melts away. And kind of in return for that, he had been spey casting for probably 10 or 15 years before that. But, he needed some brushing up. And, kind of from my experience with, warm water fishing with a two-handed rod next to people that were fishing with spinning gear, I had just built some pretty good proficiency on my spey cast. So I helped him out with a spey cast, and he kind of taught me everything I know about steelheading. And because he's kind of a well-connected guide in the area, there's a whole bunch of other people. So when we talk about, people in conservation, just long-term people that, really care about the rivers, that's kind of how I got my initial connection to those sorts of things.
How did you discover Scott? Was it just because he was such a well-known name? It was at the Bob Mitchell's fly shop. He was just one of the guys that was just hanging out, tying flies, telling stories. And he just offered to take me up to fish the baptism, or what was it? You initially told me how to fish the baptism, but then the Grand Marais area of Minnesota has just some really great steelhead areas, and I got to tag along with him up there one day, and that kind of changed everything. Yeah, very cool. Were there some other people that influenced you as well in that?
A lot of my friends that have just been doing this for a long time, and you find out as you get to know them, maybe they're about 5 or 10 years ahead of you, and you learn just from little bits of things that they just say. You're not even trying to strike up a conversation or pick their brains, but they just kind of put things out there. And it's like it makes you think about, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense, and then you kind of integrate that into your own program.
Yeah, it is funny how when you first start, if you're lucky enough to get just a few of those people to kind of help you out, and man, it just helps you flourish so much faster. Really unique scenario. I love hearing stories like that. Sounds like Scott was quite a good influence for you.
Some names of the people that would be mentors for me right now would be Paul Sandstrom, who's up in Duluth, Minnesota. There's Sean Parrish, who lives up in Hovland, Minnesota. That's just way, way up the arrowhead of Minnesota on Lake Superior. There's a couple of others that I just have regular contact with. And, every time you talk to them, that 5-minute conversation puts you about 3 or 4 years ahead of where you already were. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think it is that, I don't know, maybe makes a good mentor or attracts you to someone as being potentially a mentor to you and facilitates your climbing? What do you think?
Somehow, oddly enough, it's almost like they attract to you somehow, and I don't know how to.
Yeah, it is. It's weird. It's like I don't know, weird magnetism, right? I mean.
And I'm not a very charismatic person or magnetic, but I think people see something in you maybe that they could influence, and,
right.
and that becomes how that relationship gets forged.
Yeah, it is funny because I've experienced the same thing. It's like some people I would have never thought I would have ended up in that kind of mentorship program, where they're mentoring me or vice versa. But there's something just unique, like you connect and all of a sudden it just works.
Yeah. And then at the same time, the people that you're trying to chase after maybe, or trying to get to know, those people kind of pulled away for some reason. But
right.
yeah. But the people that you collect are the people that you collect. I don't know how else to explain it.
Yeah, that's cool. So let's talk a little bit about fishing.
I like talking about fishing.
Yeah. You're up in a beautiful area. What are some of the favorite areas you like to fish, styles, etc.?
Oddly enough, in the summertime with the smallmouth bass, I kind of put away the two-handed rods and I fish from pontoons. I do a lot of bike shuttling on the Mississippi River. Just because I like to go to areas where I'm going to run into other people, areas that are really good fisheries that are kind of overlooked. And plus just the exercise of it, fin kicking and rowing and fly casting out of a pontoon all day, and then biking 9 miles back up to your launch or your takeout, depending on what you need to do. That maxes out my Apple Watch pretty well. I mean, I like to, people, sometimes people are like, you're kind of working really hard. And it's like, well, yeah, but I don't need to go to a gym.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that I'm in fantastic shape or anything like that, but I've got kind of a regimen built into the fly fishing that I feel like keeps me pretty physically healthy.
I like that too. I mean, big part of my reason for getting in the fly fishing was for some of the fitness and exercise.
Yeah. Well, especially where you're at. I mean, there's a lot of hiking opportunities.
Yep.
And you do a lot of alpine fishing?
I do a fair amount here and there, but for me, I was recovering from being a cancer patient, and just being able to get out in the river and hike a little bit and kind of use my own pace, going from
trying to get back to your former self, kind of. Yeah,
it was really helpful. And the cool thing about it is, just like you had mentioned, it's from a fitness standpoint, it's scalable, right? So you can be relatively not fit, go out, have a great day of fishing, but get some good exercise. And then as you get stronger, you just go a little bit further, and it scales with you. So, and then that takes you to new waters or new spots. So it was perfect for me.
Yeah, there's some pretty good canyons on the North Shore of Minnesota, and like the first week that I get up and fish the Grand Marais area for steelhead in the spring, I find out instantly how out of shape I am.
And do you fish like the driftless area quite a bit as well?
I do. In fact, when I moved up to the Twin Cities from South Dakota initially, that's all I did because I didn't want to fly fish for walleyes or bass anymore. I actually wanted to learn how to trout fish. Okay. And it's like, well, it's a half hour to 45 minutes drive from the Twin Cities to get on some really primo trout streams. And so there was about a 4 or 5 year period where that was pretty much what I did.
Let's dive into that a little bit, because I think the driftless area is an area that some people have heard about some more than others. But
I wonder how famous it is. To me, it just, when you live here, it's, everybody knows about it, but I don't know. Is it really nationally known or worldwide, or is it?
It's hard to say. I think a lot of core like Spring Creek fishermen know about it because it's
maybe I want to keep it secret. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the secret's starting to get out just about on anything, but more so curious on like maybe some of the techniques and tactics that you use, because it's very crystal clear water. It's Spring Creekish per se, and I don't know, is it tailwater or are they Spring Creeks? And then maybe talk about your tactics.
Let's see. I think anything here that would be a tailwater or a reservoir would warm up a little too much to support trout. The reason the driftless works for trout is that the streams are tiny and they're predominantly spring fed.
Okay.
So they stay very warm in the winter and they stay nice and cold in the summer.
Okay. They just maintain that metabolic temperature, it sounds like.
So if you think of rivers or creeks that run from about 20 to about 130 CFS, that's kind of the sweet spot for a spring creek that will really sustain excellent populations of trout. And then when you get into the bigger rivers that are maybe an average flow, 400 CFS on up to maybe 2,000 CFS, those rivers will have some marginal populations of trout, and they'll probably hang out near the little tiny tributaries that are themselves kind of well-known trout streams.
Yeah.
And there'll be some monster trout that will hang out in those medium-sized rivers. Often there'll be fish that migrate out into the big rivers in fall, spring, and winter, and they'll go chase forage around. And then when those rivers warm up too much in the summer, they'll nose into the creeks that have colder water coming into them. So there is a lot of trophy fish here. They tend to be very cagey animals. They're hard to catch, hard to target. There are a few people that just have an absolute knack for it. I think they're usually throwing black streamers, and they will locate these fish and catch them. But mostly, the driftless streams, the average fish is running anywhere from 8 to 12, and then maybe a fish over 15 inches is considered big.
Mm-hmm.
As far as tactics that I normally do, I don't streamer fish for trout very much. And that's just because I'm always streamer fishing for smallmouth bass and walleyes. And by the time I get on a trout stream, I want to either nymph or throw a dry fly.
Mm-hmm.
And
something different.
I'll have a streamer along in case it's just an absolute knockout streamer day, and I'll fish the streamer. But when I'm trout fishing, I want to fish a bug. But predominantly, I do nymphing. I do dry flies when they're available. The problem is that the cherry dry fly season for the driftless streams around here also kind of coincides for when I'm up steelheading on the North Shore of Lake Superior.
Okay.
So I miss out on a lot of the cool hatches, but I learned the hatches really well when I was talking about that kind of 4 or 5 year period where I was just learning to trout fish up here.
What time of year is that?
I would say March, late March, early April, and into kind of the beginning of June.
Okay.
There's just a series of different blueing olives and some sulfurs, caddis, crane flies. I'm trying to think if I'm leaving anything, but they just come off in blizzard hatches.
Yeah, I've heard
it's really amazing. I think that's probably the biggest allure of the driftless area is just things just crawling off the river in the evenings, or bluing olives on a cloudy day.
Yeah. What is it, man, about dry fly fishing that can just be so incredible? I mean, when you see those like you said, blizzard or blanket hatches, and then it's just all of a sudden the river comes alive.
Oh, it gets to the point where you can almost barely catch a trout because they have too many naturals on the water to pick rather than your fly.
Right. And then all of a sudden you pull your foam beetle out and they start hammering that thing because it's just different, right? That's been my trick over the years is like, oh, I got to throw something totally different. And
what kind of fish does that work on? I guess
I do it a lot here for trout all the time.
Okay.
You throw either a big beetle or a lot of times I'll throw a bigger ant pattern. And it just seems like if you can't get them to take what is so prevalent as a natural, I mean, there's times where, like you said, it's this blizzard hatch or blanket like hatch, and you're throwing a blue wing olive out there with all the other blue wing olives. You can't even tell which one is your fly or theirs. It looks so
Yeah.
close.
Yeah.
And every time you see an eat, you're setting somewhere around and you're still not hooking up. And you're like, gosh, why am I not hooking up? And then all of a sudden I'll go, okay, it's time to switch it up. I'll throw a beetle or an ant on. Those are my
Okay.
two go-tos. And then it seems like one you can see, so you're setting in the right times and you're not maybe
Right.
spooking as much. But the other is, I think they just look at that as like, oh, that's different. I'm eating cheeseburgers and there's a steak, you know, and you can do really well.
Yep.
So what when you're approaching the river, I mean, those rivers are crystal clear. What are some of the things that you're thinking about heading out into the day to really make you successful?
Try to figure out how you're going to approach fish without spooking them, because it's really difficult. They absolutely feel your footsteps if you step in the water. Um, I guess I actually don't really put too much thought to it. It's not really enormously difficult to catch trout in the driftless. But you do have to have a little bit of patience.
It's probably more difficult to catch.
I guess
big dogs,
I guess,
right?
what's that?
It's maybe a little more tactical on the old big dogs, but just to go out and have a good successful day,
I haven't really figured out the big fish just yet, and I think those are that's something I need to learn, or maybe I just need to accept that those are fish that when I encounter them, usually the big fish. I think what I've actually experienced and what most people do is just locate where a big fish lives and come back after a rain when the creek is silted up a little bit, but still just fishable. If you know where those fish live, and there's maybe it's just 18 inches of visibility, and you throw something past them, they're a lot more likely to hit. I think what happens is this driftless area, it gets hit pretty hard because it's so close to the Twin Cities, and there's fish are well educated. I think they see tippet very, very well. They see an artificial fly very, very well, especially, when fish kind of get into that 18-inch range and bigger. I think there's a couple things happen. One thing is they become, less insectivorous and more of a meat eater. But then the other thing is that they've just been all hooked and caught on flies so many times that they know to avoid that.
Yeah, a little more wary.
Yeah, so if you want to get them on a nymph, the darker water, or coming back at night with a black streamer or a mousing pattern, that's the way to. And I haven't got into some of those things, but they're kind of on my list to try, but I just don't typically do that. Coming back in the dead of night and with a big black streamer, I think would be absolutely the way to do it.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree. We see the same thing here. I mean. Around here, the ticket is trying to go out and get your 30-incher, and you only really catch them at night. They've even done some tagging around here where they've learned that these fish go sit in a hole, and they sit there all day, and then when it gets dark, they go cruise like a half a mile upriver and back to the hole, and then lay up all day again. Really
the other thing to do is just get a noodly 3-weight and make the 10-inchers bigger.
Yes. It's super fun. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So let's talk a little bit now about some of your fly tying. I know you have a real passion for deer hair and a couple other things. You've talked about your theory. I want to hear a little bit about your theory, your mashup theory of spay, bass, pike, fly scenarios. So go ahead, dive into that.
It's not so much of a theory as just something that kind of ended up happening, but as soon as I kind of learned about Edward and tying intruder flies, something about just the look and the shape of an intruder fly just totally grabbed me, and I just kind of thought it was the thing I was kind of always looking for, especially for walleye fishing. Having something that has a very large profile, yet because it's tied very sparsely, will draw down in the water column very well. It's almost like you know, it's like a clouser, but a little bit different. Like a clouser gets deep when it has weight on it, but they're tied sparsely and they're tied very, very narrow, and that helps that fly get down. Whereas the intruder, it's a larger profile, but to me, the fly is almost tied in a way where it's hinting the outline of something with relatively little meat in the middle of it. It's a very hollow fly, but it's forming the profile and the outline of something, so that that fly can wash down in the water column or follow a sink tip. Or if you actually want to put some lead dumbbell eyes on there, that'll help out some. Sometimes you actually need a jig, but those flies that will look big in fishing the Mississippi River. There's often times when there's just a lot of dark stain in there. Maybe you only have like 18 inches of visibility or 12, and you're trying to get a fly down maybe 5 to 8 feet to a fish that's just a foot or two underneath that. And with fly fishing, it's really, really tricky to know how close to the bottom you actually are if you're never making contact. And, so I have a lot of value for a fly that has a big profile in the water and is really visible and getting down. So that's where that, the use of thinly palmered marabou and ostrich kind of came in, because if you prop that stuff on a collar, it wiggles unbelievably and has a lot of action to it. But also you have something that has some frontal area to push some water, and it shows up. Yeah, I just kind of got into that, and then it's just kind of cross pollinated into some of my my Dahlbergs, or I have a kind of a rip off of the drunken disorderly fly that I do. And mine's done with marabou and ostrich rather than I think Tommy Lynch, he uses a lot of rabbit strip, palmers a lot of rabbit strip around it, and I'm trying to take his thing that he does and make it something that's a little friendlier to cast, but also will it's not something that will draw down in the water column a little easier if you want to get it deep.
Yeah. So
and then when I tie a Dahlberg with palmered ostrich and marabou, there's really no reason to put that on a Dahlberg diver, but I think it just looks cool, so it goes on.
Yeah. Sometimes it is the look, but I agree. Sometimes you pull off some of that rabbit strip and things like that, it makes it a little bit lighter. Sometimes it gives it a little bit more action. Those are I'm always experimenting with that as well. And you're doing quite a bit with deer head. I've seen some of your poppers and things like that. What are you doing there that is kind of guiding you, or you feel like you're experimenting with?
There's 3 tires that I really try to emulate. It's Andreas Anderson Kimaki. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name. He's Swedish. And then there's Pat Cohen, of course. And then there's also Charlie Craven is really phenomenal with deer hair.
Yeah.
And all of those guys are just way, way ahead of what I can do. But I'm trying to catch up. But everything I see from those guys, I'm just, and the closer you get to doing what those guys do, the more you realize how much farther you have to go, actually.
Yeah, and it's incrementally harder every step.
Yeah.
Right.
To get,
you can get 60-70% of the way there, but the remaining percentage to get to that 100 mark, it just takes that much more effort.
It really does. It really does. Yeah.
It's hard. Yeah. It's kind of like weightlifting, all of a sudden you get up to your max weight and it's like, gosh, just to throw a couple pounds on, that's like, feels like a whole new world.
Yeah. It's absolutely right there. Yeah.
So yeah, we've covered quite a bit. You've got some pontooning, that you're doing. You're really experimenting with your flies. You're conventional background, of course, morphed into fly fishing and single handing, spade casting. I know you do a little bit of coaching on some spade casting, et cetera. So you're a pretty well-rounded guy. Why don't we do this? Let's take a break, hear from our sponsors. We'll get back, and I want to hear a little bit about, maybe some of the fishing adventures that you've had, and we'll call it a day. Sound good?
Okay.
Thanks,
Sure.
Andy. All right, we'll be right back, everyone. Hang on. Angler's Coffee. We love fueling your next cast. We've been roasting coffee before coffee was cool. www.anglerscoffee.com. Dupafish. Coming soon. Pre-register now and get notified. www.dupafish, that's D-U-P-E, fish.com. All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. Today we're interviewing Andy Selvig. And Andy, you're in the Twin Cities area, fishing Lake Superior, fishing the Driftless, a bunch of other areas, I'm sure, in and around there. But I asked you to tell us a little bit about some of the fishing adventures that you have. And in particular, I'd really like to hear some of your approaches around the personal pontoon that you run and why you maybe enjoy that so much.
So I'm a really huge fan of doing everything personally powered. Taking minimal gear as far as transportation, shuttling myself with a bike, putting it at the top end of the river and floating down, and then or in the case of the North Shore or the Brule in Wisconsin, the Steelhead rivers, those are all kind of walk and wait areas where you hike into a spot, and there's really no other way to kind of get into those areas. It's really, the smallmouth fishing I do out of pontoon boats. Smallmouth fishing from a boat is usually your boat is positioned into some faster water and you're casting at a bank where the water is moving relatively slowly. So if you're not partner fishing, where there's two people in the boat and one person is on the oar controlling the boat while the other one casts, if you're just by yourself, pontoon boats are just excellent because you put on some kick fins and you're fishing solo. So you're out in the faster water and you're slowing the speed of the boat down closer to the speed of the water that's against the bank.
Okay.
As you're doing kind of your pick up and lay down casts. And
that's just to keep your bug at the same speed of that slower water on the edge and really kind of stay in the zone longer.
Yeah. You're trying to, have some amount of control over how fast your fly moves, whether you want it to be absolutely still or if you want it to be ripping out.
Yeah.
If the water is moving, 4 to 6 miles an hour where you're floating, but it's almost dead still where you're casting to, you need to make up for that differential. Otherwise, you'll never quite present to the fish perfectly.
Yeah.
So yeah, either a 2-person boat with somebody on the oars, or when I'm by myself, a pontoon works great in a way that maybe a kayak or a canoe would not work as well. So yeah, doing your pickups and laydowns against the bank.
You can slow the pontoon down, and then you can also add upstream mends and things like that to help you out.
Yeah, and I think I have enough boat control actually with the kick fins that I don't really need to make a lot of upstream mends. I can just ride. The nice thing about a pontoon boat is that you're a very small presence. You don't necessarily need to have the 40 or 50 foot distance out from the bank because you're not spooking fish that much with a very large craft. You can be very close. So 20-foot casts are often fine.
Yeah. Plus you're really low profile because you're kind of down close to the water.
Yeah. And you're just kind of, I don't know how to say it without kind of sounding a little corny, but you're you're kind of the scale of something that would actually be swimming around in the river and wouldn't cause any harm to anything.
Right.
You're just a passerby, and fish won't really spook until you get right directly on top of them in some shallow water.
Yeah.
But if they have enough sense of space away from you, you can be very, very close, and that helps a lot, because I do make some longer casts, maybe some 40 or 50-foot casts, but my average cast is about 15 to 30 feet, just because the boat has near infinite control because you're swimming, and you can just be really tight to the bank. When you get to some shallower zones where you have to strip the fly out a long ways out of the water, and if you were that close to the fish, you might spook them. But those are areas where you might put the boat out a little farther in the river and make some longer stretched out casts.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time, I'm fishing some areas that have pretty sharp cut banks, and it's getting down to about 5 or 8 foot of water fairly quickly off the bank. And there's enough space between you and the fish that they just don't care. So you can operate very close to the fish. And
that is a good point. Sometimes those bigger boats, flashier sides, more noise, et cetera, et cetera. You just
yeah. And I don't think the pontoons get used in this area of the country quite as much.
Mm-hmm.
I think the standard thing is to go out in a canoe or a drift boat or a jet sled a lot of times. But that's a lot of trailering, a lot of motors, and just kind of stuff that's just I'm just not really into.
Mm-hmm.
I like personal craft. Either you hike or you road to get to where you're at. And that's another thing when we're talking about conservation. I think if you're talking about things that individuals can do to have a little more ethos about it, I think most things that you can do under your own power are probably better.
Yeah, it's definitely a perspective, and I like, it is something as an individual you can make an impact on today, right?
Yeah.
I love it. I like it. So, what kind of boat are you running?
So I got 3 different things. I've got NRS acquired a company called Star, and they just have it's like a 12.5-foot. It's kind of a cross between a kayak and a paddleboard.
Okay.
So that's kind of nice if I'm on a lake or on some slow water and I want to stand up and see what I'm doing. Usually I fish out of 1 or 2 boats. I've got an old Dave Scadden boat that's it's called a Cardiac Canyon. I absolutely love that boat, and I'm enormously frustrated that there's nothing currently on the market that is like that boat, because it is getting old. It's deteriorating. I think it's at least 15 years old, if not more. And at some point it's going to need to replace, but it's pretty dog-eared. I just keep running it. And it basically, what I love about the boat is that it has the speed of a canoe or a fishing kayak, but you have the control with your kick fins on it. The pontoons on it are just very long and very, very skinny compared to most pontoon boats. So a lot of pontoon boats out there are kind of sluggish.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of fat pontoons that are relatively short, maybe like 8 foot and 16-inch diameter. They are, they're made for mountain lakes, or they're made for going down, kind of some fairly high gradient rivers where the river is going so fast that you're not really worried about your traveling speed. If anything, you're trying to kind of slow things down a little bit. But where I'm at in, Wisconsin and Minnesota, you do need a boat that can travel fairly well, get you from place to place, because you'll hit some frogwater sections, or the general current speed might be about 2 to 3 miles an hour, and you want something that moves around a little bit. But then when you're smallmouth fishing, you still need that aspect of being out in faster water, casting into these little egress pockets against the bank, and having some really good boat control to augment your fly fishing. So that's I think what's happened is if that boat that I'm talking about, the Skadden, it's about 11.5 foot long. And I think what the market wants is if you're going to have a tube that's long, people kind of want more or less a 2-person boat. And the single person boats are more the kind of 8 to 9 foot range.
Yeah.
And that is a slower design, and but it does make it cheaper to manufacture, and they can sell those boats. But unfortunately, for the part of the country that I'm at, I don't think they work back. And then the other thing I have is just an NRS Gig Bob, and that's just a more compact boat. If I'm concerned about space in the car, that thing just crumples down into a suitcase.
Yeah.
And
I have a Outcast Stealth Pro that I use.
Yeah.
It's very much like that. No frame or anything. It's
the
boom,
blow
boom,
and
boom,
go.
boom. Yep.
Yeah.
But you're right. The Skadden, I've been on some of those bigger boats, and they have a great purpose. You can contact Skadden. I've heard of people going back to them, and they may not carry the tubes and things anymore, but they know of where people will do it on the side, replacements and things like that.
You can have some. There's some people out there that will build you some custom tubes. It's just that when you're doing it as a one-off, it's really, really expensive.
Yeah, really expensive. Yeah, I can see that.
Versus something that's just manufactured, and then you can kind of get it, closer to maybe the $1,000 mark, or
Right.
$1,500. But yeah.
Hey, all good things come to an end, they say, right?
Hopefully later than sooner.
That's right. That's right. And then, do you carry 1 rod, 2 rods typically? How do you approach your gear
For smallmouth?
Yeah.
Okay. Usually 2 rods, and it depends on what the maximum depth I need to reach is. So there's different sections of river where maybe sometimes a really fast sinking line would just bottom out too much. So I'll use like a Type 3. I've got an Airflow Sniper. I really like that line. It's a Type 3. So if I'm in in rockier sections of river, it doesn't carve out so deep so quickly. But in more of the clay sand areas of the river, you'll have sharper cut banks that drop down into 10, 15 feet of water instantly.
Yeah.
So in those areas, I want a really fast sink, and what I kind of use is another airflow line called a Streamer Max, which is just it's kind of it's like the old Jim Teeny lines, but I think it's just a little bit slightly improved. But it's very, very simple, like a Teeny line, because it's just it's a level line sink tip that you custom cut to whatever feels good for you. And then at the back end of it has just like an intermediate section that kind of there's actually kind of quite fat, and it kind of functions as a bolster, so that when you're bringing your sink tip in and you get that intermediate chunk to the line, it's pretty easy to roll cast your sunken fly back up to the surface and then just pick the whole thing up and chuck it.
Yeah.
So
you don't get that belly either, so you have a lot better contact, it seems like, with your fly, from what I've heard people saying as well.
Yeah, and everything is kind of going to these like triple density lines for that purpose, where your fastest sink rate is at the front tip of the line, then you have a medium sink rate at the belly, and then the back end of the line is a lower sink rate. That's becoming a real fad with I know Rio and SA is really going in on building those rather than just one sink rate for the whole head.
Right,
but
right.
This line isn't quite that concept, but it's kind of like that. I think for me, that bolster section is just provides an easy way to get your fly out of the water and get it casting again.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm either using one of those 2 sinking lines. I never really use an intermediate. I use the Type 3 because for me, the Type 3 feels like more like what an intermediate should be. It gets the fly down about 2 feet deep, maybe 3 feet, but it won't quite bottom out in some of those shallower areas.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing I carry is just a floating line. I use I've got the Titan Taper SA line that is the jungle version. Mm-hmm. So, when you're smallmouth fishing in the summertime, it's often it's 80 degrees or hotter, maybe 100 degrees, and you need a line that's not going to wilt. So that jungle taper is kind of something that seems like it's formulated for really hot weather, sticky weather, that the smallmouth just love. And then I use that for my Dahlbergs. And what I'll do is I'll get a very, very short poly leader that's, maybe only about 3-4 feet in length. That's kind of a little bit fast sink, just to help keep my Dahlbergs from skipping. And sometimes people have the same issue with poppers. Sometimes when you with smallmouth fishing, you always kind of want to get your popper or your Dahlberg to land about 5 inches from the bank every single time. And then if you're going to pop it, you absolutely don't want that fly to skip and then land about 3 feet away from where it was at. You want it to kind of be right in that same little zone that it landed in. And so when you pop it, maybe it only moves 5 inches.
Right.
And it almost kind of effectively dead drifts against the bank as you're popping it, and almost kind of sucks towards the bank. Whereas if it skips, then you just, you kind of almost wasted your presentation, because you're waiting for that fish to kind of get underneath it. Sometimes they're instantly there and crushing it, but sometimes they're trying to crappie stock it. And, you need it to be dead drifting against the bank and just moving really, slowly.
Yeah. And without that poly leader, you're just kind of really ripping it over the surface.
Right. And then it kind of helps when you want your Dahlberg to dive a little bit, that poly leader, while you're kind of pausing and waiting, that poly leader is kind of just gradually kind of nosing under the water, so that when you do strip the fly, the fly will actually, you'll get another 8 or 10 inches on your dive.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Rather than just popping 5 inches under the surface. And I think that's a really good dynamic. So, and it doesn't add too much weight to the casting of the line. It's just enough just to help your fly just kind of nose under a little bit, but not,
it still turns over.
Not a big wonky sink tip. Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Well, Andy, it's been great talking to you, and
certainly
a wealth of knowledge. I appreciate you coming on board, and I'd love to get you back on maybe down the line and talk a little bit more about the area and some of your other tactics. But we're up on time today, and again, I had a great time having you on the show, and appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I had a good time too. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. We'll catch you next week, and a new guest. Thanks again.